By now, I'm sure it's no secret that I'm a bit of a fool for a good survival horror experience, and to be honest, it's getting harder and harder to explain why. For some reason, your typical fixed camera, tank controls, and resource management that comes with these old horror games just speaks to me. I think a lot of it comes from enjoying a game's atmosphere more than its fun factor, but as a lot of my fellow fans of the genre have figured out, it can be hard to find a quality experience when venturing outside the heavy hitters like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Sure, there are options out there, but few could hold a candle to the games that inspired them, and it was this very search for a worthwhile survival horror contender that brought me to today's pick. Is there any way a movie tie-in could soar to the same heights as my beloved RE? Well, let's start it up and see. It's gonna be that kind of day, huh? What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. Before we get into the Ring Terror's realm, we have to talk about the first part of the title. For those of you who missed out on America's Japanese horror obsession in the early 2000s, The Ring was an adaptation of Hideo Nakata's seminal creepfest, Ringu, the tale of a reporter chasing a story regarding a VHS tape that, if watched, causes a viewer to die in 7 days. In itself a take on an old Japanese folktale, Ringu did really well in the Japanese box office, so it's not exactly crazy that developer Asmik would want to capitalize with a little tie-in action, and the subject matter makes survival horror a pretty nice fit, but for some reason this combination just feels kinda weird to me. That being said, this is the least weird thing about the game, so let's get down to brass tacks. Terror's Realm starts out with our protagonist, Meg Rainman, on the phone with her boyfriend Robert, making plans for a nice night out. Only when she arrives at his house, she finds that he's much more dead than she last remembered him being. After this premise-setting intro is finished, we take control of Meg on her first day as a newly hired member of the CDC. It seems like she's taken Robert's place and is even working in his office. It's a little creepy. While making the rounds and introducing herself, Meg finds that Robert was not the only employee to die this way, and since the other 3 deaths happened in the same exact method, the authorities have locked the building down in case the deaths mean a leak of some kind of deadly virus. This all apparently taking place in the 10 minutes it took her to get settled in. And just when things couldn't get any worse, she's also dealing with info from another character who was important enough to show up in the intro, reporter Jack Nixon.
Like, hey man, what's happening here?
Hold on a moment, sir.
I know the 2 of them. They're friends.
It seems like the other CDC scientists were working with Robert, and they all had a program on their computers called Ring. Apparently the police are looking into it, but they can't seem to get the program to start. And sure enough, Meg finds the program in question. Ring starts up immediately for her, and as soon as she enters her name, she finds herself in some kind of post-apocalyptic setting, decked in military gear and apparently involved in some type of fight for survival. This specifically brings us to some pretty damn cool story points, but talking about them would spoil what I think is a moderately okay story, so if you've beaten the game, don't leave any comments that might screw things up for first-timers. After waking up back in the real world, Meg now has to figure out how this program is linked to the researchers' deaths and why her new boss is acting like he has something to hide. So if I'm being honest, the setup here is actually pretty interesting. I was intrigued enough at the start, and the game paced out the revelations well enough that it kept me interested in finding out what would happen next. At one point we find out that the events of Ringu actually took place in the world, and Robert's CDC team somehow sequestered the remains of the girl responsible, Sadako. Then we get some nonsense about Sadako's curse somehow becoming a virus instead of a psychotic murder tape, and in keeping with the times, it's now put into effect by this program Ring. And while I'm making fun of it, there are some really cool plot points, honestly. My favorite being a nice little nod to the source material. The research found that everyone who died from watching Sadako's tape actually contracted a virus, and that's what ultimately killed them. This little revelation puts the story much closer to RE territory than I was expecting, and makes for a pretty cool little tale. After all that, I'm sure you're thinking something along the lines of this sounds completely ridiculous, and it really is, but it's an entertaining type of ridiculous. The events and characters are just coherent enough to form something that actually held my interest for a while, but this is all fighting against the game's most horrific feature.
No! No, I can't believe it's Robert! No!
Yep, that's right, god-awful English localization is here to stay. And man, it's been a while since we come across something like this on this channel. Feels kind of cozy, you know? And when I say bad, I mean like really bad. Maybe the worst English translation job I've ever played. All over the place, there's really odd grammatical errors, misspellings, and some of the most awkward dialogue you may ever see. And if you think I'm being hyperbolic, well, go ahead and give a listen to the Oscar-worthy performances going into the intro cutscene.
He's absolutely Mr. Thickhead, even on my last birthday. Well, today's the day. He has to make up for it.
And if the whole game was like this, we might have the video game equivalent of Troll 2 on our hands, but 90% of the game is just text, and to be completely honest, it kind of adds to the charm. I get a real PS1 clock tower feel from this story and setting, and that is a very good thing. I mean, yes, on paper this story sucks on an earth-shattering level, but I don't know, I kind of like it. Sure, it has massive issues with a poor translation and a premise that requires intense amounts of suspension of disbelief, but it just all feels so quaint in a campy B-movie type of way. Are there better stories to be found in other survival horror games? Without a doubt, but let's face it, you're probably here because you've already played all those games, so you may as well hold your nose and dive in. If my time here on YouTube has taught me anything, it's that survival horror seems to mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, but I think we can all agree that a few key elements have to be present. Backtracking through a creepy environment, collecting keys and items that will unlock more creepy locations to explore, limited inventory space, and depending on who you ask, tank controls. Well, I'm happy to say all of these elements are present in the Ring, so case closed, right? We got a great game here, might as well just skip to the end. Well, things are never that cut and dry around here, but before we start to get into specifics, we have to cover some ground level stuff. In the Ring, we take control of Meg, and the gameplay is broken up into two distinct experiences. In the real world, you're exploring the CDC building in order to solve the mystery of this brand new virus being spread around and how it relates to our dead boyfriend and his experiments on Sadako's corpse, but you'll also have to open up the Ring, which takes you into the game world, which acts kind of like Silent Hill's hellish otherworld. This is where you'll encounter these weird ape-like creatures, and some lizards too, don't ask, and as you'd expect, the game's combat, which sucks pretty damn hard. Just like we're all used to, holding a trigger and pressing a face button aims and shoots respectively, but there's a lot getting in the way there. For one, the animations take an insanely long time to initiate, and there seems to be no reason for it. It's not like there's so many frames in the animation that it takes a long time to complete. It just takes a second or two for anything to trigger after hitting a button. The same exact problem rears its ugly little head when you press the run button, and I honestly mean a second or two. The wait in between pressing something and an action taking place is crazy annoying and leads to an incredible amount of cheap hits, but even if the buttons responded right when you pressed them, you'd still be left with some terrible controls. While moving around, Meg gets caught up on damn near every part of the environment that isn't a flat, wide open surface, and thanks to a combination of the Dreamcast D-pad being just god-awful and this relatively helpful jump move activated by hitting the run button and back, you'll be stopping all forward movement just to fake a quick hop backwards every time you end up trying to navigate a corner too fast. Coming back to the combat, I really hated how stiff and rigid it felt. Firing a shot into an enemy just feels like it carries no weight, and the poor animations make it easy to stun lock your target, but hard to figure out when you're doing any damage. So it essentially goes like this. When a shot connects, an enemy will rear back, but if you get another shot off during that animation, it will essentially cancel the enemy's reaction. So what you want to do is time your shots out so that they're connecting right when the previous animation finishes. Which sounds like it would be a breeze to capitalize on, but the Ring has a nasty habit of having one of these things pop up at random times and in the worst locations. When this happens, they literally get in a free hit, and maybe more if you can't put them down in time. Also, the game uses a sort of auto lock-on, but this feature is more likely to work against you than with you. For example, there's a lot of these lizard-looking things crawling around, and when they get close, Meg can't decide if she wants to aim at the horrid abomination at her feet or the wall just beyond it. She will literally bounce back and forth between aiming high and low, which almost guarantees your next shot will do more damage to the drywall than your actual target. And as if the complaints couldn't come any harder, let's talk about the crazy long load times. And I do want to clarify here, it doesn't exactly take a long time to load a save game or anything like that. It just takes a long time to do anything else. Now, I can understand for the game to pause for a second or two in the first-person door transitions, but I honestly think the game takes way too long to load in the damn inventory screen. Honestly, it takes ages to get into your main menu, which is the only way to manually reload your weapons outside of doing it in the middle of getting your face chewed off by a skinless gorilla. Oh, and the map you'll be needing to look at all the time can only be accessed by this screen, so get used to hearing your Dreamcast have a fucking heart attack every time you forget where you're going. So I gotta be honest with you guys, there is more bad than good here as far as gameplay goes, which really bums me out. I really liked what these guys were going for, at least on paper. The stark difference between Meg's Detective Simulator and the pristine and sterile CDC building and the dirty, dingy video game world is really interesting. And if I'm being completely honest, I found myself more and more preferring the investigation in the real world despite there being no threat or failure conditions. I was actually kind of interested in where the story was going, and I started to dread the moments when I knew Meg would get sucked into the game world. It feels like this developer started with a cool twist on the established story of The Ring and worked backwards from there. Now, in fairness, it is worth pointing out that 90% of RE clones completely shit the bed when it comes to implementing the genre's difficult yet rewarding combat, so I wasn't exactly expecting a masterpiece, but a survival horror fanboy like myself has to admit when things have gone wrong, and things have most certainly gone wrong here. Those of you looking to quench your thirst for dark, spooky horror titles from the past might want to stay very far from this one, but if you can appreciate interesting design, even when it fails, and you enjoy seeing how other devs interpret what made games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil tick, maybe think about taking a risk here. Worst case scenario, you can give your copy of Countdown Vampires a run for its money as the worst survival horror game in your collection. The Ring is probably the most Dreamcast looking game I ever laid my eyes on, and don't you dare act like you don't know what I'm talking about. Games developed exclusively for the DC have some of the most recognizable quirks I've ever seen in a console, and I've always loved that. 3D models are designed well enough and look just this side of okay, aside from this woman who is clearly a space alien doing a bad job of fitting in. But they do lack any real punch, if I'm being honest. Animations are expectedly terrible, and for some reason our protagonist is stuck with the same shit-eating grin regardless of the situation, and might I add, runs like she might die if her arms ever touch her side. The CDC building you spend the game in looks actually pretty good, and like I said before, really gives me a PS1 clock tower kind of vibe. The main enemies of the game, these skinned monkey-looking things, are just kind of average-looking, and they're animated so poorly you could be forgiven for thinking there's a plot twist coming up where you've been fighting robots this whole time. When you get sucked into the Ring program, you are essentially transported to this game's version of Silent Hill's so-called Otherworld, and this looks pretty damn good to me. Not exactly because there's any cool graphical effects to speak of, but more because I've always liked the idea of subverting expectations by including run-down and rusted versions of the same areas a player's been going through. The obscenely Resident Evil looking inventory screen uses very high-res 2D art and looks pretty damn pleasing. Of course, the crazy amount of time it takes to load this screen may make you dread ever opening it up to look at it. Aside from the game-specific stuff, like I said, this is a very Dreamcast-looking game, and yes, that is a good thing. The DC has always had crisp video output, and a little help from the XRGB Mini FrameMeister really lets the console shine. The surprisingly noise-free 480i picture that's coming from this custom JP21 cable I got with the help of the always awesome Import Gaming for the win is razor sharp, and this time around I've elected to leave the FrameMeister zoom feature turned off. As you can very clearly see, the Dreamcast trademark dithered picture is well on display here, and as a side note, I would really love to know more about this. If you're familiar with the console's video output, you've likely seen this tiny checkerboard-like effect present in high-quality upscales derived from its VGA output, but I've never really had it explained to me, so feel free to sound off in the comments section if you have a little insight. Now, like I said before, I am using a custom JP21 cable to pull a 480i signal out of this Dreamcast and passing it through to the XRGB Mini for the crisp image you see before you, and I know a lot of people can be pretty turned off at how good upscalers can show flaws that may never be noticeable otherwise. After all, most of you are used to seeing a composite picture displayed on a CRT, and that can hide a whole mess of interesting stuff, so maybe use this footage as an opportunity to dip your toes in the proverbial pool of retro video upscaling. But aside from the Dreamcast quirks, I'd say The Ring is a pretty poor showing. The environment looks great, with every office being furnished believably, and the building's design sticking to that obviously late 90s Japanese architecture that I love so much, but things break down when there is characters moving on screen. I mean, they're not terrible looking, and some are actually pretty interesting, but the stilted animations are just too crappy to be even remotely convincing. For some reason, these pre-PS2 RE clones just did not want more than 4 frames in any one animation, but for what it's worth, I'd say the game looks, I don't know, okay overall. There's some relatively nice looking pervertex lighting being applied to Meg's flashlight, and speaking of Meg, don't you dare tell me this face doesn't look like it belongs in a PS2 era Shin Megami Tensei game. Oh, and on an unrelated note, the music in The Ring is actually pretty good. Sure, the theme of the CDC building could stand to be a bit longer so it doesn't repeat as much, but I actually found myself whistling a few tunes after the Dreamcast was turned off, so there's a good sign. And as a last note, due to what I assume is a failing Dreamcast disk drive, I had a couple of issues with the game locking up at loading points, which isn't too interesting, but twice I was greeted with what looks like a command prompt giving an error message. Both times it was when the game tried to load a cutscene, and it was actually kinda cool to have a very limited look at what's behind the curtain, as it were. I honestly kinda dug the world that The Ring placed me in, and there's just a quaint budget look that's very passable in my opinion. Don't come in looking for a game that even competes with the kings of survival horror, but instead expect a low budget look that plays pretty well to the cool parts of the Dreamcast signature quirks. Certainly not the best game I've ever laid eyes on, but not the worst either. That's a good thing, right? Alright, well, this has not exactly been a positive review so far, but let's give the devil his due and see how the pros and cons stack up. Sure, this may not be a classic, but in the realm of survival horror, we aren't exactly drowning in options. I've always appreciated an interesting and immersive game world, and once you find your bearings, I think that's exactly what The Ring has to offer. I actually kinda like the story here, and the way they tied the movie's tale into it with Sadako's virus was pretty damn cool. Alright, there's no getting around it, this game has shit controls. Not only is it ridiculously hard just to change directions, but if you're anywhere near anything at all, expect to get caught on it. Okay, so I have to be honest, I kind of enjoy this type of poorly done, cringy English localization, but I know I'm in a very small minority in that case, so be aware. The enemies in this game are nowhere near creepy looking enough. I mean, sure, everyone has a different idea of what scares them, but I sincerely doubt these guys are frightening anyone. The logical part of me wants to tell you guys to stay away. I mean, for all intents and purposes, this is a god-awful game, but I think there's a bit of heart buried under all the missteps here. I think the hardcore fans of the genre might actually find some catharsis in playing through such an odd look at all the survival horror tropes they know so well, but the rest of you would probably find more fun in a broken leg, so let's call this the opposite of a glowing recommendation. I know that I got a lot of enjoyment out of The Ring, but I doubt very seriously the rest of you will. And with its price on the rise for some reason, I wouldn't blame you for letting this one just pass you by. And with that, I do have to get out of here, but I will be back soon, so as usual, I'm Jared. And this is Avalanche Reviews. Thanks for sticking around, guys. I've been on a bit of a survival horror bender as of late, and if you are too, I've linked some videos on screen that you might get a kick out of. And if you want to support more weird-ass videos like this one, feel free to swing by my Patreon page. I love all of you guys, and hopefully I'll see you all later.